Hello, this is Everybody Settle Down. I'm Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. We are back and we have some breaking news, Eric. This is a tight race. The polls are tightening and this is a tight race, okay? As if you didn't expect that already. How you doing, buddy?
Doing well, man. Yeah, it is it's super tight. It looks a lot like 2016 and 2020.
Okay, so let's dive right into the polling, the betting odds. Basically, the betting odds haven't really changed much since we last spoke. And just for all the listeners and viewers out there, the timing of our podcast last week wasn't great considering the second we ended, we had the big announcement from RFK and the speech, which we'll get to. But some swing state polling has come out and some you had the Fox News poll as well, which I think was interesting. Basically, it looks like Kamala Harris is in pretty good shape in a lot of these swing states.
Yeah, and in the Fox poll, it had the four Sun Belt swing states. So Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. She was up in three of those four, but all four were within 2 points one way or the other, which is obviously well within the margin of error, which means essentially tied. And then there was a poll today from Emerson that had all seven swing states. And basically, that was pretty much the same thing. The best margin for either candidate was 3 points. Trump was up three in Arizona, and Harris was up three in Michigan. And every other state was one or two, one way or the other. And so it's this is a tie, basically. The betting odds are 50-48, 50-49. The Harris is ahead nationally by around, depending on which average you look at, somewhere between 2 and 4 points. And the swing states are basically all tied. And that's pretty much what 2020 was, if you remember. Biden won by 4.5, which is about where Harris is right now on the higher end of some of the polling averages, around 4. But in the swing states, almost all of them were very close. Some of them decided by tens of thousands of votes. And that appears, who knows, things could change. But that's looking like where we are now. Harris probably wins the popular vote, although you never know. But the race is decided by these swing states by 10, 20, 30,000 votes in some of them. Now, I will say the one big advantage that Harris has gained over the last, since she's been the nominee, I think is putting North Carolina back in play. Like, she's gained in all of the swing states over what Biden was doing. But North Carolina had pretty much been moved off the board. That was almost certainly going to Trump. Trump won it again in 2020, barely by like 2 points, I think, even though he lost the popular vote, as I said, by 4.5. But now Harris is actually leading in North Carolina in some polls. It's very close. And it's essentially moved into now the same range as all the other swing states. And in fact, I would say Harris probably has a better chance to win North Carolina maybe than she does even some of the other swing states. So it's right there for her. And the reason that's so important is when you get into the electoral math, Pennsylvania is absolutely critical because it has 19 electoral votes. We've talked about this before. Like, if you look at the scenarios, for Biden, it was almost impossible for him to win without Pennsylvania. And it looked like it might be the same for Harris, but putting North Carolina in play gives her an out now. Because in the event she would lose Pennsylvania, it's still going to be really hard for her to win. I want to be clear, but not impossible because North Carolina has 16 electoral votes, as does Georgia. So if you lose Pennsylvania, but you win either North Carolina or Georgia plus Nevada, which has 6, that replaces Pennsylvania. And now Harris could still win if she takes Michigan and Wisconsin, losing Pennsylvania. Now, I don't think that's likely to happen. It's still very likely that whoever wins Pennsylvania wins the election. But if all of these states, and again, some of them will probably break one way or the other. Like, I would feel pretty good about Michigan if I were Harris right now. She's up by an average of about 3 points there. But if for some reason all or most of these states end up clustered together very close, you could see a scenario where she loses Pennsylvania by half a point. I'm sorry, there's a garbage truck right outside my window you may be hearing. But she wins North Carolina by a half a point to make up for it.
Okay, so I'm checking the odds and polling up to the minute here. So Real Clear Politics has the average at Harris plus 1.8. I look at that about every day. I feel like yesterday was plus 1.7. So a slight bump there for Harris. That's the averages. The election betting odds right now, Harris 49.5%, Trump 48.7%. I always find this interesting though. They have the electoral map though still going to the Republicans, and that's because of Pennsylvania, which you mentioned, which if I can show it here, it's basically an absolute toss up coin flip. Right now, 50.5% chance it goes red, 49.5% chance that it goes blue to Kamala Harris. I think either way, and this is a very, very obvious statement, but looking back, and I kind of thought this anyway. Like when I said Joe Biden didn't have a chance, I understand there's a 5, 10, 15% chance. But if Joe Biden would have had an okay debate and stayed in, I think this is a boat race. And when I say a boat race, I mean electoral college boat race. We know a Biden could still maybe beat Trump in the popular vote. But like it is so obvious that since the Democrats made the switch, all of these states now are so competitive. All the blue wall states, you now, if you're a betting person, you probably say, okay, more likely they go to Harris. But as you mentioned, the fact that she has opened back up these Sun Belt states, and Eric, you and I have done this podcast for what, 7, 8 months now. And I feel like at the worst of Joe Biden, when he was down in the polls, we were seeing the Arizonas, the North Carolinas, the Georgias. I'm talking like they were getting close to double digits, right? Like
Yeah.
8, 10 points going towards Donald Trump. So even if Kamala Harris doesn't win any or all of those states, the fact that she's making them all so much more competitive and she's making Donald Trump and the Republicans campaign more in these states, spend more money in these states, just overall it's an obvious benefit to the Democrats and down ballot as well. I think we're going to have a much more competitive election, top to bottom now, because even if you don't love Kamala Harris, she's a much better candidate at this point. It's such an obvious statement, but she's a much better and more competitive candidate than Joe Biden. It's not even funny.
Oh yeah. Look, all those people. There were many of them in the Democratic Party who basically were like, "Stick with Biden." I mean, it's so clear how wrong they were, and you and I thought that was the case for a while, and I think the numbers bear that out. Couple of points. So it looked like when Biden was in, I'm talking even pre-debate, but especially after the debate, his chance was essentially hold the blue wall and eke out a 270 to 268 electoral college win, right? That was pretty much it. Well, Harris obviously still has that path, win the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and win 270 to 268. But because of those other four Sun Belt states, she has opened herself up now a range of possibilities to win. But what hasn't really changed is the gap that could exist, that could be quite large between the electoral college and the popular vote. And I think that's something definitely to keep an eye on. In terms of the Real Clear Politics average, look, I like Real Clear Politics for several reasons, but I do not love their polling average because, as you mentioned, it has Harris 1.8. But a lot of the reason for that is because they have very few polls in there, and one of them is Rasmussen, which is kind of a garbage poll, and it always has Trump ahead. I think it's interesting. It only has Trump ahead by 2 now, which shows you how this race has moved. Because in Rasmussen, he was up by like 8 after the debate. It's always been an outlier. In the other polling averages where they don't treat Rasmussen like it's 50-50, where they fade it or shade it based on, like, Nate Silver has one on the Silver Bulletin, The Hill has one. They're at more like 4. So I think the true lead right now is Harris around 4. But remember, Biden won by 4.5 and barely won the electoral college. If you change less than 100,000 votes in 3 states, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, then Trump would have won, even losing by 4. So it's no guarantee that Harris can win if she wins the popular vote by 4. I think she's in pretty good shape, but it's not a guarantee. And if she only wins it by 1 or 2, I think it's advantage Trump. If it gets to be about 3, now you're probably in the gray area of recounts and, chaos. So that's something to keep in mind as we think about all these things. The bullish case for Trump, though, and the reason that I think he's done fairly well in the betting odds recently is a couple of things. First of all, we haven't seen a big convention bounce yet for Harris. Now, we haven't seen a lot of national polling since the convention. There have been very few, and I don't think there's been any really high quality national polls that taken entirely after the convention. The few we have, Morning Consult has Harris by 4, and Yahoo has Harris by 1. We'll get more here later in the week. So far, not really a big convention bounce. Also, for whatever reason, and we could talk about the reasons, but Real Clear Politics has the past margins at this moment in history in 2016 and 2020. In 2016, Hillary Clinton led Trump by 5.9, so by 6. She won by 2 in the popular vote. So that's a move of 4 points toward Trump in 2016. In 2020, at this point, Biden led Trump by 7. As I said, the margin ended up being 4.5. That's a move of 2.5. So he moved 4 points in 2016 from where we were now to the election, 2.5 in 2020. If he does that again, moves it somewhere between 2.5 to 4, he will win the election. So if the same thing happens, he will win. Now, why were the polls not accurate in 2016 and 2020? Well, there's one of two reasons. Either he closed really well and he moved it toward his side, or the polls were a little bit off all along because of, take your pick, Trump voters not answering the phone, maybe the shy Trump voter theory, which is people who don't really want to tell a pollster they're voting for Trump, but then they go into the polling. I don't think that. I think Trump has been normalized in such a way that I don't really necessarily buy that as much, but it's certainly possible that maybe there's a few percentage of people, a small percentage of people are just like, who really like Trump and are going to vote for him, but won't tell anybody, including a pollster on the phone. So for whatever reason, though, that history, I think, is important. And that's the bullish case for Trump is, for whatever reason, the polls underestimate his support by a few points, and a few points is enough to swing it.
Let's talk about some of the stories of the week. You had at Arlington National Cemetery, you had the 3-year anniversary of the 13 soldiers dying in Afghanistan, and then you have the whole fallout from that. So obviously Donald Trump is there and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden aren't. So Republicans go and say it's such a bad look for Kamala Harris not to be there. And here's Donald Trump, and he's the commander in chief, and this and that. And just big picture, look, I understand politics. I understand how dirty it is, but I do feel like, and both sides do this, but when you're also using tragedies and you're weaponizing them for politics, it feels really dirty. And I understand that. Look, that did look like a win. You hate to say it like that because this is 13 people who lost their lives and their families are there, but it looked like a positive for the Trump campaign as he's there and he looks presidential and Kamala isn't, Eric. But then you have basically everything coming out afterwards that basically he wasn't supposed to be there and this wasn't for photo ops. And some people are mad that their graves were shown. And you also have a story, Eric, about the fact that the Trump campaign supposedly kind of strong armed some people to get in there to have their moment. It it just feels very icky to me when you're talking about a tragedy and people that lost their lives. And by the way, bringing that up though, bringing up that policy is 100% fair game. If you're saying, hey, the Biden Harris administration bungled this, and because of them bungling the dismount essentially from Afghanistan, a big reason why 13 people lost their lives. But what we saw this week to me is the worst of politics.
It's a tricky thing. There is a pattern Trump has where he will have some advantages and then he or his campaign will do something to step on them, right? And I think that may be what we're seeing here. I thought they executed the critique of Afghanistan pretty well during the convention when they had the families there speaking, because that's really the thing. It's a little bit seedy, I think, for the candidate to kind of bathe themselves in the blood, for lack of a better term, of
Mhm.
these, dead Americans. But I think it's much more effective and powerful when it's the family members themselves criticizing the Biden administration for what happened and for the response afterward. And so I thought when the Republicans did that at their convention, when they had that really well produced video, they had the families there hitting Biden, I thought that was very effective. That was one of the lasting things I remember from the Republican convention. And let's be honest, that withdrawal was bungled and chaotic. And Biden and his administration, they were in charge and they deserve criticism for that. So I think it's fair game, and I think it was executed well at the convention. And I don't even mind Trump going to Arlington on the 3-year anniversary and laying the wreath there. Look, is it political? Sure. But the family was there with him. Again, I think that gives him some cover. The problem was when he went to what's called Section 60, which is the part of Arlington that is reserved for the graves largely of people that died in Iraq and Afghanistan. Apparently there, in that area, you're not allowed to be videoing, certainly for political purposes. So I think what happened was there was a dust up and the army came out. And look, the army, as we know, doesn't want to get involved in politics ever, let alone 2 months before an election. But the army today issued a statement and said that participants in the ceremony, quote, were made aware of federal laws regarding political activity at the ceremony and abruptly pushed aside an employee of the cemetery. Now, this employee was apparently trying to basically say to them, hey, let's not shoot a TikTok video here at the gravesite of the fallen in Arlington, right? That employee, according to the Army, was abruptly pushed aside. The Trump campaign put out a statement when this first broke a few days ago, and they said that an employee was having a mental health issue. I mean, that's a hell of a thing to say, right? You're saying an employee of the cemetery was having a mental health issue, and that's why they had this confrontation. Now the army is coming out. So again, it's just another example, and there are many of these, where Trump has an issue or a line of attack that maybe could benefit him. And rather than just kind of taking the win, they try to push it a few steps too far, and it ends up backfiring and coming back and hitting them in the face. And I think that's what has happened here. Also, look, as I said, there's a way to be critical of Biden, but it is worth remembering, and I think we do a good job, you and I occasionally trying to bring context into this, that the Afghanistan war was going on for 2 decades. Pretty much everybody thought we probably should get out at some point, right? The Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban a withdrawal that cut out the Afghan government that we were supporting from those negotiations. That process was well underway with a definitive exit timeline when Joe Biden was sworn in. So I think that's important to remember. Now, could Biden have executed that better? Yes, absolutely. But that timeline, that agreement was already in place. Also, part of the issue was you had COVID. And COVID was delaying the processing of people at the Afghan embassy to try to get them out. And then, of course, what a lot of people didn't see coming was the Afghan government just completely collapsed like overnight. So is there a world where we could have gotten out of Afghanistan in 2021, given all of that perfectly cleanly with no casualties and orderly? Maybe, right? Maybe there was a world. But I don't know. I don't know if that, given all of those circumstances, if there was a way we could have exited Afghanistan in 2021 with no casualties, completely orderly and cleanly. I just don't know if that world exists.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note this was a terrorist attack that took place. I feel like Afghanistan was always going to be our generation's Vietnam, and you hate to say it, but after a while, you kind of forgot we were there. You know what I'm saying? And obviously, if you had a son or daughter serving there, you wouldn't forget. But after a while, you kind of felt like, okay, the war was over, but we were still there. And then when our troops leave, and you're thinking, man, it's been 20 years. But as we were talking about this last night, my wife and I were, and we were talking about that exit. And she's like, when I think about just memories that you can't get out of your head, and you probably remember, I mean, the people falling off the plane, right? Like you always remember seeing about the last chopper out of Vietnam, right? Like and hearing those
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah.
But in the social media age with camera phones and all that, when you literally see people who are so desperate that they're falling off an airplane. I mean, if that doesn't hit you how bad things were over there, you heard stories about mothers that I remember reading a story, mothers throwing babies basically over um, barbed wire fencing just to get them to the other side to safety. Like, whoever catches this baby on the other side, United States troops, whoever it is, my baby has a better chance of surviving once I toss them over this barbed wire fence than being on the other side. I mean, that's
Oh,
insane. And
it
I
is.
remember when that plane was taken off, and I think there were one or two people, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that fell off the airplane. And you're wondering yourself, you go, is that real? Because nowadays so much stuff is fake. But
Yeah,
man, like that was as real as it got in a bad way. That was just the
it was crazy.
images and video were crazy.
I just think it's important to remember on these things, and you and I have talked about a lot about this with COVID. When you have these big events that go through administrations, in the case of Afghanistan, starting with George W. Bush, right? And the policy continues, it's not as clean as saying, oh, all the blame is on the Biden administration. I want to be clear, there is blame. They were in charge. They could have started this earlier. They clearly miscalculated. I mean, the biggest miscalculation was the strength of the Afghan government. They
Mhm.
felt like this Afghan government we propped up would, at the very least, get through 2021 and get allow time to get everybody out. Obviously, that didn't happen. The Afghan government faded. The president got the hell out of town, and the army just basically faded away. And that was a terrible, terrible miscalculation. There were others. But again, getting out directionally was the right thing. I think pretty much everybody agrees with that. It was the execution of how it was done. And there is to completely divorce the decisions that the Trump administration made to negotiate with the Taliban and set up a timeline from the chaotic result, I don't think is entirely fair either. I heard like John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor, is adamant that the Trump administration set this up and deserves some of the blame. Now, there are others in the Trump administration, of course, who deflect the blame and say, oh, no, Biden came in, we washed our hands of it. He could have done it completely differently. I think, as usual with most of these things, the truth is probably somewhere in between, right? Like the truth is there's blame to go around with Afghanistan, probably on administrations going back to George W. Bush. But look, at the end of the day, Biden was the one in charge on that day, and it didn't go well.
Yeah, I think you could even make the argument that we could have been out potentially at the end of the Obama administration, certainly
Yes.
throughout the Trump administration. And it is funny is not the right word, but Joe Biden in doing the right thing and actually leaving, but then it's used against him because of the way it ended. And like you said, I don't know if we're ever really getting out there clean. And also, if we're being fair, let's be real about this because politics play into all this. It's probably one of the reasons Obama didn't leave. It's probably the reason Trump didn't leave. And oh, by the way, the withdrawal was negotiated after the election. You know, that was not an accident right there. I,
Yes.
I
Right.
think I think look, it was a terrible withdrawal. And Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, their administration deserves a lot of the blame. But as you said, so does Trump, so does Obama, so does George W. Bush. Maybe even you could say more on Biden because he was vice president for 8 of those years, right? I
Yeah.
mean, Joe Biden was involved for hell, the whole deal, if you talk about his political
Right.
career.
And think about it this way: if you had, let's say, the Afghan government had held up at least for a while, and let's say that the withdrawal had been gradual and it had gone over the course of months and months. Are we sure that there would have been no terrorist attack near the airport that would have killed America or anywhere else that would have killed American troops during that time? I mean, is that a bet you'd really be willing to make? The Taliban, look, they broke the agreement they had with Trump. Uh, so, this idea that had Trump just been president, everything in Afghanistan would have been perfect. We would have gotten out totally clean because, as you said, he could have ended it sooner. He chose not to. He chose, with his maybe for good reason, to push that into 2021. And of course, then he lost the election, was no longer president.
Yeah, I do think though, big picture, the argument that was the world safer under Donald Trump? And people can obviously debate that. But I do think if you are using the bucket of, well, look at Ukraine, Russia, look at Israel, Palestine, look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, you can certainly make a very compelling argument from the Trump side that things seemed a lot calmer under Donald Trump than they have been the last 3.5 years under Joe Biden. And again, that's something on the campaign that I would be hammering nonstop if I'm on
Yeah.
the Trump campaign. I'm not talking about Kamala Harris's race. I'm not talking about Tim Walz and the tampons and whatever's going on. Like, that's what I'm hitting home. Like, hey, wasn't everything kind of calm and relatively easy breezy? Even if it's not 100% true, I think it
Right.
felt like that to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think the and I think this is true. I checked this the other day, and if I'm wrong, please let me know, but I'm pretty sure this is true. More soldiers died under Donald Trump than Biden. You know, it's
Mhm.
one of those things Trump and his people always say the world was safer. Well, and look, I want to be clear. We were in a war in Afghanistan. It wasn't as hot as it had been, but we were still involved in Afghanistan for Trump's term. So it makes
Our
sense that more
troops.
our troops. So it makes
Yes.
sense that more soldiers died under Trump. But I think that's an interesting counter to the argument that America was safer. We had a war going on still with Donald Trump as president, and Americans were dying in higher numbers than they did under Biden. And now, say what you will about the tension in the world, and it's certainly there, we don't have any active wars going on right now. There aren't American boots on the ground fighting, in any of these conflicts. They're there, they're close, they can still, be injured or killed, and they are, but in very, very low numbers. And I think that's worth pointing out. The question, of course, to me is not trying to rewrite history. It's where do you go from here? If I'm the Harris campaign, right? If I'm the Harris campaign, I'm like, well, look, we could go down the road of hypotheticals all day, but here's where the world is now. What do you want to do, going further, going forward in Afghanistan or in the Middle East and also in Ukraine, right? What's the plan? And of course, Trump says, well, I'll just come in and work out a deal, on day one. I've got this magic peace deal. So I think there is a counter to that argument. But you have to make it forcefully and you have to explain it a little bit. And you have to talk about why standing up to these autocrats is the right way to go, not trying to make a peace deal, in the case of Putin at all costs.
Tell me what you think about this, because I feel like this falls down partisan lines when I'm talking about foreign policy. Because when I hear people from the right, and it's mostly, in my opinion, people from the right who are just saying the world's on fire, the world's on fire. And again, I get that. When you look at essentially two fronts of different, whatever you want to call them, wars, conflicts, battles, whatever it is, with Ukraine and Russia, and also now Israel, Palestine. But I do feel like, and again, maybe this is 100% politics, but I think a lot of people on the left, and I think a lot of moderates make the designation that, look, we don't love that these wars are being funded, but there's a big difference in putting our troops, United States troops, in harm's way. And I knew that stat also, whatever the number was about Afghanistan. I think, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I think we were losing about maybe 10 to 15 soldiers per year at the end there. So whatever the number is of soldiers that died under the Trump administration, was it 64? Was it something like
I'm
that?
not sure what the number is. Look, to be clear, it's been low on thankfully, thank God, right? It's
Right.
been low under both Biden and
Yes.
Trump. But I think it's just such an important because the way the Trump people frame it is we are in like World War III, we're fighting everywhere in the world. And that's just not true. We have military assets in position in various areas. We got a shitload of our battleships in the Persian Gulf right now, as we should, to deter Iran. The question is though, or the issue is we had more soldiers die under Trump and we had a war going on under Trump and we don't have a war with that military, with US military boots on the ground right now. So I just think the context there is important. That doesn't mean Trump doesn't have good arguments on certain
Sure.
things. Like he can say, and it's true, Putin didn't invade when he was president. So I agree with that. I think couple of other things to keep in mind too, certainly when it comes to the Middle East. I mean, the Israelis and Palestinians obviously have a history that goes back, way before Biden or Trump were president. And I think that war in particular has a lot more to do with domestic Israeli politics than it does United States politics. I mean, if you're familiar with what was going on over there prior to October 7th, the Israelis were at each other's throats. There were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets protesting against the judicial reforms of the Netanyahu government. Israel was incredibly divided. I mean, there was even some talk of maybe a civil war down the road in Israel. And I think Hamas looked at that and said, this is our chance. They have never been more distracted, never been more divided. And, they were able to execute that surprise attack on October 7th. The question is, we have not had, despite a lot of predictions of a massive Middle Eastern war after that, the Biden administration and others have helped keep a lid on that so far. So far being the key. Like, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? But those predictions of World War III breaking out, haven't been true to this point.
Yeah, and I guess just the way I look at it, when I hear the World War III and all that, which by the way is for clicks. It's so easy to talk about, oh, if you say for 10, 20 years, oh, it's always going to be World War III. I mean, World War II ended in frickin' 1945. Wars aren't even fought like that anymore. Just when I've gotten in discussions, arguments, whatever, last couple years, people on radio and all that, and when I constantly hear this World War III and the world is on fire, and maybe I'm looking at it just from a different perspective, but as a 42-year-old man who essentially the second half of my entire life, we've been in basically Iraq and Afghanistan almost the whole time, right? September 11th was right when I was 19, 20 years old, and American troops were on two fronts in wars for 5, 10, 15 in terms of Afghanistan, 20 years. It just rings a little hollow for me when people are telling me, "Oh, now it's the worst it's ever been." Now it's the
Right.
worst. Not when we had our soldiers in two wars for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but now because we're essentially aiding and funding and helping our allies, which by the way, like whether or not and how long we should be there and how much we should help is 100% legitimate arguments to have. But when I hear, oh, now it's on fire, it's the worst it's ever been, I'm like, really? Like
Right.
we're funding allies that were attacked and our boots on the ground are not there. Like there's a difference. I think most reasonable people realize that difference. But again, I understand the political gain to always be talking World War III. It's the worst it's ever been.
Right.
Let's be real about this too. The Trump administration or the Trump surrogates, like their idea for this campaign is it's the worst anything has ever been. Economy, I mean, the world sucks. America's on decline. That's all you hear basically. That's the strategy. It might work, it might not.
Yeah. And it's not only the American deaths that we've talked about being lower under Biden. Like, if you just look at and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you just look at the number of people killed in conflicts globally, it is over the last several hundred years, we are dramatically lower now. Like, as you mentioned, you had World War One, you had World War Two, you had the Korean War, you had conflicts and wars all over the world. And we actually, and big reason for that, by the way, that's not a fluke. It's because we set up, the United States and others, a post World War II order where we basically said, hey, it's probably not a good idea in most instances if countries just invade their neighbors and take their land and call it their own, right? And so that still happens, but it happens a lot less. And that is the point of the Russian war. Is it okay for a country, a powerful country, to just decide that it's going to just take over another one? That hasn't happened much in Europe since World War II. In fact, this is the biggest conflict in Europe since then. And that's kind of the point that I think you got to step back and look at is there are people and countries who want to do really bad things, who don't like that world order that the United States has helped lead. They want autocrats to decide what borders should be and who should rule and where the power should be. And I'm talking about Russia. I'm talking about China. I'm talking about, Iran. They want that. That doesn't change no matter who the American president is. They're looking at a long-term trajectory. So the question is, how do you respond to that? And what I would say if I was the Harris campaign, I thought she did a great job of this in her speech on at the Democratic convention, is if you negotiate with Putin by essentially letting him have the deal he wants, which is the only way Putin's going to agree to a deal, no matter who the president is if he gets most of what he wants. If you give that to him, yeah, you could stop a war. The war would end. We wouldn't have to fund Ukraine. But what's the cost to that? Not just to Ukraine, because you now let Russia take over a part of their country. You've now emboldened Putin. You think he's going to stop? You think he's just going to be like, yeah, thanks so much. I'm good now. I got everything I wanted. What's his lesson going to be from that? His lesson is going to be all I have to do is outlast the Americans in the West. Eventually, they'll give up. They'll let me cut a deal favorable to my terms. I can manipulate Trump with flattery if he's the president. We know that. And Putin doesn't have to go to war then, because he just gets what he wants without it. And then he bides his time. And what lesson does that send to him for the future? And what lesson does it send to China? Because we know they have interests in Taiwan, in islands in the Pacific, disputing those with the Philippines. The message is America doesn't have the backbone for the fight. Not only will America not fight directly, they won't even fund the fighting from someone else to do it. And so now maybe it doesn't happen in a year, but down the road, these countries then make the calculation that America just isn't in it and doesn't have the fight. That's what the Ukraine war is about. It's not about Zelensky. It's not even about necessarily just Ukraine. It's about how do we stand up to these governments? It's a clash of civilizations right now. And if you give in a war, again, you're not even fighting. We're spending a tiny fraction of our defense budget. And if you give in to Putin, then you send the message in the future, and deterrence is essentially dead. And that is the argument that I think Kamala Harris is right on that argument, and Joe Biden's right on that argument. That used to be the Republican argument, by the way, but now not under Donald Trump and the MAGA party. But that, I think, is how you make that argument, and you come back and reframe it.
All right, let's talk about this interview tonight. If you're listening right now, we're recording on Thursday, 1:09 Central Time. But this interview tonight, the sit down, the first interview for Kamala Harris, sit down interview with a journalist since the announcement that she's taken over. It's going to be her and Tim Walz, and obviously, because it's a dual interview, you've seen folks from the Trump side talking, and it's a good line, by the way, calling Walz, "Oh, you need your emotional support animal to do the interview," which again, that plays well. That's good strategy right there. Now, but then you have the other side coming back and saying, well, every single ticket basically has done these dual interviews. If you go back to whoever with Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney and whoever's running, all these tickets do these joint interviews. I do think, though, that the narrative was building. It had been too long, right, for Kamala Harris not to do an interview, even though she does talk to the press when she's doing the rallies and she's talking to people during the rallies and at the convention and all that. But she needed to do an interview. It was about time. I think they should have done the dual interview for sure. I think that's interesting. I don't know if that should be the first one though. So I'm kind of on the side of the Republicans here. First of all, Kamala should have done an interview sooner, even though it was all about raising money. It was all about the convention. It was all about kind of setting your policy before you go down and tell people about your policy. But it feels like it had taken too long. And although she should do an interview with Tim Walz and kind of put out there a united front, I don't know if I would do the first interview together. I do think it shows more strength, commander in chief, leader of the free world, if she sits down and does the first one by herself.
I think I agree with you. I don't think the interview thing is nearly as big of a deal as people in the media think it is. Like, I don't think the
Yeah.
average voter is sitting out there being like, "Oh, what I really want to see is Kamala Harris grilled
Ah!
by the national media." But I do think that it is important, and I think that they should follow this up with some other interviews. That's what I would do, because one of the things that got her in trouble And one of the reasons that Trump, look, we know the Trump campaign is hoping that she flubs some of these interviews. That's why they're pushing this so hard. And they have reason to think it's possible she will, because in 2021, that's one of the reasons that she became so unpopular as vice president, is because when they put her out there, she did not do well in some interviews. There's particularly, infamously one with Lester Holt, where he asked her about the border and if she'd been there, and she said, "Well, I haven't been to Europe either." The Trump campaign is using that today in ads attacking Harris. That's how bad it was. But then what happened is, rather than get her out there after some of those interviews for more reps and to kind of clean it up, they pulled back. And I don't know if that was the Biden administration telling her not to do it or she made the decision on her own, but that's exactly the opposite of how you handle it. You don't build these things up to be something bigger than what they are. Trump does interviews, to his credit, all the time, and he says stupid shit in these interviews all the time. Like, you could play it on loop, but people don't really fixate on it that much, because he'll just come back and do another one tomorrow and he'll say something dumb again. I mean, he told Dr. Phil the other day that he'd win California if Jesus was the vote counter. He lost California by like 30 points in 2020, by millions of votes. But nobody even cares. That was barely a story. Why? Because Trump says stupid, ridiculous things all the time. So saying dumb and ridiculous things in interviews is not a deal breaker. But when you build it up to be, and CNN is smartly building this up as a primetime event, now if you say something dumb and that's the only interview you've done, now people will jump all over you. But if she
Mhm.
said something tonight, let's say, that needed a little cleanup, and then she was doing another interview tomorrow and then another one Saturday, you just easily come back and you say, "Hey, the other night in that question, I just want to be clear. I want to clarify what I was saying." You know what I mean? So my point is, from a strategic standpoint, more is better once you start. I don't really care that it took 4 weeks versus 5, or 3 weeks versus. The point is, it's important she does them and does a decent amount of them. I don't really care how long it took to do them, but don't put too much on it where it's this one-off huge event. Follow it up with more interviews, and I hope they do that. That way, if you do say something, you can come back and clarify your remarks, because there's a lot of things that she's going to have to explain in these interviews that there's it's ripe for some good questioning.
What do you think of the RFK bump or lack thereof? It seemed like the betting odds had already moved when the reports of that came out. And also just the timing. First of all, I thought it was brilliant timing from the Trump campaign to basically, after the 4 days of the DNC and everything's great and the flags and the balloons, to essentially steal all that momentum the next day, about 12, 15 hours later, with the RFK Jr. announcement. Then you also wonder, with the polling and all that, because you did have this, you would think, quite a positive for the Democrats with the convention, and then a positive for Trump. We just don't know how much with the RFK announcement. And also, you and I talked about this before the speech, and we're thinking he's going to drop out and endorse Trump. He suspended his campaign. He's staying on the ballots in basically all the states except the swing states. He wants to get more than 5% vote, which I think is actually important. Whether you like RFK Jr. or not, we need third party candidates to have power moving forward. I think the two party system is destroying this country. So I think powerful third party candidates in the future is important. I still don't love what RFK Jr. did and is doing here, but I did watch the whole speech, which I feel like was about 45, 50 minutes. And it's hard for me to really disagree with that much that he's saying. Look, the Democrats did do him wrong, right? Now, look, both of these parties are a threat to democracy in different ways, right? Like, Donald Trump tried to overturn the election, and you have what the Democrats have done with censorship that came out this week with Mark Zuckerberg. Even though we kind of knew about that because he did an interview with Joe Rogan a couple years ago and basically laid this out with the Hunter Biden laptop, but also everything the Democrats have done with the primaries, even if it's not illegal, it just feels wrong. But with RFK Jr., everything he talks about in terms of health, of our food supply, of kids and chronic disease, I I agree with almost everything he says, and I do think, although he has a huge ego, I think at the end of the day, all these politicians have huge egos. I've watched him in so many podcasts. I do. I do believe he's being genuine. I think he really does care about the future of our kids and our health and our food and the environment. I do believe he's genuine in that.
All right, RFK Jr. fans who hate me, are you ready? I'm going to say something nice about RFK Jr.
Oh, oh,
I also watched the Friday speech, and then I watched him later that night with Trump in Arizona when he came onto the stage. And I have to say, that is the RFK that I like. He didn't go down the road of crazy conspiracy theories. He didn't talk about vaccines at all, which was great. Like, if he could just avoid that subject, I think that would help him. But I think he focused like a laser. I mean, he said some ridiculous things about Ukraine, but we've already talked about that. I think he's dead wrong on that. But most of his speech, which the media really didn't talk about because it came in the second half and they only cared about him dropping out endorsing Trump, was on that issue that you and I have talked about before, which is the sleeper issue in America, which is basically the poisoning of our children and adults with our processed food in this country. It's a combination of big ag, big pharma, lax regulations by some of our government agencies. It's all contributed to America being, as he points out, the sickest wealthy nation in the world with these obesity rates that are through the roof, all of these chronic diseases. It's bankrupting our country, and it's only getting worse and worse and worse as the food becomes more and more processed and the pesticides. And when he talked about that stuff, I'm like, this is what I love about RFK Jr. So if he just sticks to that and Trump just puts him out, and look, the thing I would say is, how committed is Donald Trump going to be to this kind of an issue when the special interests, many of which fund his campaign, are going to be like, hey, are you sure about this, Donald? Like, are you sure you want to go after big ag and big pharma? Because that's not something he did during his first administration for the most part. He was not going after big ag and big pharma at all. In fact, he was the opposite. He was funneling money to the agriculture industry and not really cracking down on big pharma. He made some motions that way. But remember, it was the Biden administration who made the first step with the Inflation Reduction Act, which allowed Medicare for the first time to negotiate prescription drug costs with pharmaceutical companies. So I don't know if Trump will follow up on it. I don't even think if RFK Jr. knows if Trump will follow up on it, but I like just him raising the issue, I think, is important. He's right on that issue. And I hope that if Trump wins, I hope Trump will allow him to do what needs to be done to help clean that up. Because I think it would be a tremendous thing for our country, and it'd be great for RFK Jr.'s legacy. And if he just sticks to that, I'll be happy. Now, look, I've said before, I think it's shameful that he endorsed Trump. I think he knows who Trump is at his core. I think he's clearly he essentially admitted it in the speech. Like, I'm 70. I've got like 10 years left to make a difference. I want to do something, and I know I can't win. And he's right on all of those things. I still don't think that justifies endorsing Trump. But for his own selfish interests, I understand why he's doing it. And I hope that if Trump wins, he's able to follow through on that, because it would be his legacy, and it would be something that could help America maybe more than any other policy, that an administration could implement if they really cleaned up the food supply and took on the big agricultural industries, big ag that controls, so much of our food supply.
Yeah, and it's important to note, I shouldn't say the main reason that we had such terrible outcomes from COVID versus a lot of other countries is because of the obesity
Yes.
epidemic we have in this country, and the fact that whatever the number was in terms of, the average number of comorbidities of the people that died. I mean, look, if we were much healthier, if we were leaner, the outcomes from COVID in the United States of America would have been much, much better. So RFK Jr. is 100% right about that. How about we empty the old notebook? What else you got here this week?
Well, Jack Smith refiling charges in the January 6th case. We knew this was probably coming after the Supreme Court's immunity decision that said presidents have pretty wide immunity. Jack Smith made some changes to the charges to line it up more with the Supreme Court precedent. I think it's interesting because there's a hearing next Thursday. And it's possible this case is not going to go to trial before the election. And if Trump wins, it will never go to trial. But there could be a kind of mini trial to determine if these allegations contort with what the Supreme Court said. If that happens, you might get some testimony, some things might come out, and it just may kind of remind people, hey, you remember, I know Trump's on the ballot again. Remember what happened the last time he was on a ballot? Like, Harris has not made that a central focus, I think, very wisely. Uh, like, I think Harris's campaign, I think they've been very smart. And one of the smartest moves they made is shying away from making January 6th and Trump trying to steal the election such a central focus. Biden made it. I mean, that was his first big speech announcing he was running again, was focusing on that. Like, that was everything to the Biden campaign in a way that I thought was just, because I agree with most of what they say, but the people like me who already agree, they're with you. Like, they're with you anyway. Like, the people who think January 6th was a big deal and Trump tried to overturn the election, probably already with you. But having it in the background is not necessarily a bad thing for the Harris campaign as they focus on other things. And also Trump, kind of makes it that way too. Like, there's a January 6th awards ceremony coming up in a few weeks that is going to be at his Bedminster Golf Club, which apparently he's not participating in, but we know he said he will pardon, many of these people. And I think it's something that is there, especially as Trump tries to portray, the Republicans as the party of order and police. After police were, beaten on that day, and some of the people beating the police are now in prison and may or may not be pardoned by Trump. Also, again, it gets back to what I said earlier. He continues to say crazy stuff on social media, on Truth Social. I don't know if this even matters anymore because, again, I think a lot of it is so baked in. But it's amazing what we just take for granted now. Like, Donald Trump shared more than a dozen posts on his social media network Wednesday that called for the trial or jailing of House lawmakers who investigated the attack on the U.S. Capitol, special counsel Jack Smith, and others, along with images that referenced the QAnon conspiracy theory. He also reposted a photo. Now, some of these are like re-truths, right? So they're not actually his original thought, but still, he's re-truthing them for a reason. One of the images he posted, one of the memes he reposted, was an image of Hillary Clinton standing beside Kamala Harris, and it said, "It's amazing how blowjobs influence both of their careers." This is again, we
It is
take all this
funny.
kind of for granted. It's like this guy wants to be the president. It's probably not appropriate for a presidential candidate. B, again, it's not smart. It's the same thing with, you have issues if you're Trump where you can attack the Biden Harris administration, but yet what he goes back to this stuff. He goes back to she just turned black. All of these things, and I'm sure his campaign advisors probably just pound their head against the wall in private. They're probably like, "Can you just focus for 1 minute, please?" But look, this is who he is, right? In a way, it's kind of refreshing. Like, he just can't help himself for very long. He can do it for a while. He can do it for a speech or sometimes for a week or two, but he always goes back to these same things that remind you of who he is. And look, it's not hidden. He's basically saying, "I'm going to jail my political opponents, or I'm going to try to." He's saying it, right? He tweeted out, or he truthed out a picture of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. It was a doctored image, and Hillary Clinton in orange prison jumpsuits. And then, of course, the lewd post about Harris and Clinton that referenced a sex act. Also suggested former President Barack Obama should be tried in a military court. Like, he's not hiding it. You know what I mean? That's why I say, when I talk about RFK Jr. and some of these other people, Tulsi Gabbard's another one, who come out and endorse this guy because they want power or want to be close to power. Like, the guy's not hiding who he is, right? And again, that doesn't mean, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean you have to love Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or the Biden-Harris administration. It doesn't mean you think they've done everything perfectly. It doesn't mean you don't care about inflation or the border, or you and I have criticized them on Afghanistan. Like, there are lots of reasons to criticize Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, this administration. But our politics is a choice, right? In America, we have two parties. We have a binary choice. This is who you got, right? You got Kamala Harris and you got Donald Trump. You have to pick one.
Yeah, and this is why it's now something that it's not even worth talking about. But it was 6, 7, 8 months ago when we started this podcast, which is, I think a lot of people in this country, they're not even necessarily against a lot of the conservative or Republican policies. Now, some of them here and there, but it's more about being against Donald Trump, which there is a little bit of Trump derangement syndrome. But I think a lot of people do focus on January 6th and trying to overturn the election. That was the big line where it's like, you cross that line, I'm never coming back. But the reason I bring this up is, you already, in my opinion, you made the wrong choice. Even if Donald Trump wins, I think you can make the argument they made the wrong choice because a Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis wins this much easier, right? Like if Nikki Haley is running against Kamala or Ron DeSantis is running against Kamala, they might win, they might lose, but it's like your normal politics, right? Whereas when Donald
Absolutely.
Trump's out there, he changes the whole game with how he talks, how he tweets, how he does the truth socials. Again, everything you mentioned, I laugh about that now. If that had happened 20 years ago, it'd have been the biggest story on earth. Trump
Right.
does it. Trump does it, and this is part of his genius. He does it 20 times a day, so you just
Right.
don't care anymore. Like
Yeah.
he does 20 times a day something that would have been the biggest story on earth 20 years ago. And he does it
Yep.
so much that people are just like, that's Trump.
Yep. His superpower is he has no shame. Like in life, to not care about how your conduct affects others or anything you say or never feeling bad about anything you've done is really like, it's not a good character trait, but it gives you a tremendous advantage in life. If you just don't only really mainly care about yourself and don't ever care about anything you've done or said, you can get away with things that other people would just feel too guilty to get away with. They wouldn't be able to do it. And so that is kind of his superpower. And look, I just go back to this. We based on what we said, to circle back to the beginning of this podcast, it appears very likely this election is going to be extremely close and maybe decided by tens of thousands of votes in a few states. Can you imagine a scenario where that happens and Donald Trump comes up short and he graciously or even ungraciously concedes the election, wishes Harris well, says I'm going to ride off into the sunset? Of course not. There is a 0.0% chance of that happening. He will do everything he can, legal or otherwise, and summon the worst forces in our country to try to overturn that result. Now, will he be successful? I don't think so. He wasn't in 2020. He's not the incumbent president now. I don't think he will be. But for a fact that he will try. And flip that to the other side. Let's say Harris loses under similar circumstances, barring clear proof of fraud, like proof that we all see and is plain as day. There's no way she would do that. She will concede, right? We know that. Again, unless there is obvious and clear proof of fraud on a scale that, we haven't seen in American elections in our lifetime, certainly. And to me, that at the end of the day, what your position is on abortion or immigration or what you think the tax rate should be or federal spending, what programs you like or don't like, or whether we should fund the war in Ukraine, all those things are very important. And I have opinions on all those, just like most people do. But I also recognize those things don't matter nearly as much as what I said a few minutes ago. Those things we can fight about and argue about, and maybe Ron DeSantis, would be better on those than Kamala Harris, or maybe Nikki Haley would be. That would be a different conversation. But those things don't really matter if you can't trust a candidate to accept the results of an election. It's a threshold question, right? You can't even get to the other stuff, in my opinion, if you can't just get to the threshold of accepting a loss. And it's not even about accepting it, because I don't care if you accept it in your head. I don't care if you're bitter about it in your head. I care about, do you actively try to rile up the worst parts of America to overturn that election, basically by any means possible? That's what he did in 2020. And I mean, is there anyone who thinks he won't do that again?
Yeah, and not just overturn. I think what's gonna happen is this. I don't think there's gonna be any civil war or anything like that. I think there's gonna be hijinks with the certification in
Yes.
some of
Yep.
these states and counties, And again, I'm not worried about uprisings, but I am worried about, right, if something happens in some particular county, some particular state, you're going to see these poll workers get harassed. You're going to see people who oversee these elections, secretary of state, whatever it is, you're going to see them become the targets on social media.
Yes.
That's what I predict will happen if Trump loses. Again, if Trump wins, from his standpoint, it's all good. I agree with you. I think Kamala Harris is going to just concede and move on. So that's that. All right, buddy. Hey, good show. Appreciate it. Everybody comment, like, subscribe, share the show, share the channel, put it on social media, put it on your group text. We'll see you next week. We'll talk about the big interview. It's funny to call it a big interview. It's just an interview. Right? Shouldn't be that big of a deal with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz tonight on CNN. All right, buddy. We'll see you, man.